It cannot be touched by human hands throughout the whole process. So they would go through and you pass it, and then they would take it, and when they were done, they would prepare it, and everybody's around waiting for this. This is a whole ceremony in and of itself. So they would take it, and they had a special place that they would prepare this grain, and so then they would use it by taking it and breaking it down, not touching it. They would put it on a special area, and they would have plates with little perforated holes so that when the grain would pass over, it would be touched by fire, because he talked about it being offered on fire. And so they would take this grain, they would have it processed through this fire, and then they would have it in some now this is barley grain, just so you get the idea, but this isn't the way. It would get down to a level of powder that they would have it. Then they mixed it with oil, if you saw that was being described here, the way that they would prepare it. And so then they mixed this whole grain. So out of this whole sheaf, there would be a portion of that would be the grain that would be prepared. And then the priest would take this portion and he would do the same, where he would bring it throughout the temple and dedicating and lifting this offering up to God in prayer that he would be pleased that this grain that came from the earth was brought forth to God and that he would receive it. And then a part of the command was they would take a portion of this. Even though it says a handful, they didn't use their hands because they didn't. The minute they touched by human hands, it's been defiled. Not in the sense of being unclean, but in the sense that it was processed through humans now. And the one that needs to honor it and touch it first is God. No human being should ever touch it. And so they said, you are not to eat any bread or roast or new grain or do anything with this grain until you've offered this up to God. It has to come to Him. And so that they would offer this up to God with the idea that if they had processed and prepared this and done it properly and given it to God, He will receive it. And He will not only bless the offering that was burnt to Him and the offering that is lifted up in this the processed grain that they had and the offering that was in the sheaf, but He would also bless the harvest. And so it represented the whole harvest that would take place that season. And that's what would take place when they would do this first. This ceremony that was being done, believing that if God accepted their offering, then the whole harvest would be blessed. So what was the big deal? Why would they go through all this big ceremony? Why was it such an important thing to be able to make sure that it was all given to God first before anybody else cut a single stalk out of that particular harvest? Well, for one reason, it was to consecrate the harvest to God. Grain that comes from the earth being lifted off was symbolic that this grain is being given to God, that it is acknowledged of God. This whole harvest comes from God, and it's being dedicated to God, and it's looking to God for His blessing. It was important to be able to acknowledge that it has to pass through God first. It cannot come from human hands, being processed by humans and then given to God. It had to come from the way of God Himself and coming back. And with that strong dedication of giving it to God and honoring God with it was the belief that God would in turn bless. And that's, if you look through Proverbs 3, 9, and 10, for example, it says, honor the Lord with your wealth, the first fruits of your crops. Then your barns will be filled to overflowing, and your vats will brim over with new wine. Malachi 3:10 says, bring the whole tithe into the storehouse, that there may be food in my house. Test me in this, says the Lord Almighty, and see if I will not throw open the floodgates of heaven and pour out so much blessing that you will not have room enough for it. Now Malachi and the book of Haggai were actually, that's what the promise was to this test. But both of those passages, and they're written in your insert, and you can look them up later as well, we're speaking to the fact that the Israelites had kind of gotten away from this. They were no longer dedicating to God first, but in fact, they were giving God extra or leftovers or second portions or whatever. And as a result, they were suffering curse from God, and they were not seeing the blessings of God. And so they took serious this idea of consecration, of an act of worship, of giving to God. And how important acknowledging Him as being the provider and Him as being the one who is that brings about the blessing of their harvest. Not anything that they could do. And so part of this, then, too, was a reminder for them of the true purpose of life. for a farmer or for anybody who's working, it's easy to get caught into the day-to-day toil of the task and thinking of looking at your crops as you're preparing it and realizing, boy, is there enough here to feed a family? And, are we going to be able to do good this year? How's it looking? And all of that. And get caught into the things you're doing. But by going through this particular ceremony, this particular worship, this feast of the first fruits, it was a reminder that the true purpose of life is to love God, to serve Him, and to obey Him in everything in our life. It was a reminder to know that we are to be dependent on God in everything, that in fact all of it belongs to God. It is God's crop, it is God's produce, it is God's working hand, and He in turn is blessing us with it. And so it was a way through this feast to be able to keep themselves in the right perspective of who is the one that we really need to put first. Jesus talks about this in Matthew 6 when He gets onto the subject of worry, and He says, don't worry about what you're going to eat or what you're going to drink. Don't worry about what you're going to wear. Isn't God going to provide for you like He promises to provide for the sparrow or the birds and all the... He's going to provide for you as the lilies of the field. He's going to provide for you as well. And so Jesus ends in Matthew 6:33 where He says, seek first the kingdom of God and His righteousness, and all these things will be added unto you. And that's what they're doing through this feast. They're taking this, preparing this, offering up to God. Seek first God and His righteousness and believe that He will provide, He will bless, He will be able to bring to you all that He needs. That's what was taking on when they prepare this feast. That's what they're thinking about as they're going through this particular feast. But where's Jesus in this? Well, He's in a lot of places. Certainly, first of all, in the events that took place at that particular time. Jesus rose from the grave on the feast of first fruits. If you didn't know that. What's interestingly in this is that particular year, the two feasts of first fruits, the Sadducees' first fruits, which is the first day of the week, and the Pharisees, which is the 16th, regardless of what day of the week, fell on the same day. Coincidence? Or did God time that in a certain way? So no one could argue and say, no, you can't connect that because no, it was on a Wednesday. No, they both fell on the same day. Everybody was celebrating Feast of First Fruits that particular Sunday morning. And it was the day that Jesus rose from the dead. And so it's a way in which God had brought that all together in His timing. And that's, you guys have been through calendars, how that falls. And it doesn't happen, very often. Kind of a rare situation. But to God, it's not. It's His timing. The other thing is when we hear about what Jesus said in the way Jesus responded even as He rose. And let me just say to you, by the way, the Feast of First Fruits starts in the evening. And so Jesus was found on a Sunday morning at the empty tomb. That's when they went out there and got to the tomb and He's empty. We don't know specifically when Jesus rose. If we consider all the other feasts and the perfect timing of God, I wouldn't be surprised that when they're offering up this grain on a Saturday evening, we call Saturday evening, they would call it a Sabbath or the first day of the week, started on at 6 o'clock. So if they're doing that at 9 o'clock at night, I can imagine God would say, this is the moment, and that's when Jesus rose. But they found Him on a Sunday morning. That being said, when they did discover Jesus, in John 20:17, when the women had seen Him, they wanted to grab Him, and Jesus said this, do not hold on to me, for I have not yet returned to my Father. What was He doing about that? Well, if He's the first fruits, then what He's saying is, I can't be touched yet by human hands because I have to complete this offering of who I am to God and complete the full offering to Him so that He's received and accepted me. And so there's this not allowing human hand connection that ties into what Jesus was being said, that He's an offering lifted up on our behalf to God like a sheaf being lifted up, and He cannot be touched by human hands until He's presented to God. The other one is there's a story about people rising from the dead along with Jesus. In Matthew 27:50 through 53, I don't know if you've ever read that part of the story, but it says when Jesus had died, there was the curtain ripped and there was an earthquake and stuff, and it says in there in 52, the tombs broke open and bodies of many holy people who had died were raised to life. They came out from the tombs, and after Jesus' resurrection, they went into the city and appeared before many people. Well, that would fit in line with what happened in this whole ceremony, because as they bring this out of the field in a bundle, there's a lot of grain, and then a portion of that grain is put together and prepared, and then there's a portion of that grain who's prepared for the actual offering on the altar.